Hello and welcome to another Talking Shop with Covering Climate Now. I'm Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the Executive Director at Covering Climate Now and the Environment Correspondent for The Nation magazine. Our subject today, boosting your climate confidence on every beat in the newsroom. We're joined today by distinguished colleagues from Time Magazine, CBS News, HuffPost, and Climate Matters in the Newsroom. But first, for those of you who don't know, Covering Climate Now is a consortium of more than 400 news outlets with a combined audience of roughly 2 billion people around the world. We're organized by journalists for journalists to help all of us improve our coverage of the defining story of our time. Covering Climate Now is free to join. There's no editorial line that you need to follow except respect for the science. You can find a list of all of our partner outlets and apply to join Covering Climate Now on our website, coveringclimatenow.org. You'll also find our weekly newsletter, The Climate Beat, which is co-published every Wednesday by our co-founders, Columbia Journalism Review and The Nation magazine. The Climate Beat lists the best climate journalism of the past week, highlights upcoming developments in the climate story, and even tells you which newsrooms are hiring. Everyone can sign up for the Climate Beat, whether you're a partner of Covering Climate Now or not. Especially relevant for this talking shop are the resources on our website, again, designed by journalists for journalists. We have concise fact sheets on everything from Climate Science 101 to the 10 best practices on climate coverage, and Covering Climate Now's next week of joint coverage, which we do 2 or 3 times a year. This year, in the run-up to Earth Day on April 22, our partners will be doing stories around the theme, Living Through the Climate Emergency. By the way, calling it a climate emergency is a statement of science, not politics, as one of our fact sheets explains, and as we'll get into in just a moment here. And finally, for those of you who are maybe relatively new to the climate story, don't miss the short essay by TV reporter David Schechter of WFAA, that's the ABC affiliate station in Dallas. David writes about how he used to feel intimidated by the climate issue and how he got over it. And David just won a DuPont award for a brilliant piece of climate journalism. So his advice is probably worth listening to. I think that a lot of journalists today are in the same boat as David was. We know now that we cannot avoid the climate story, not least because the new administration in Washington is making it so central to its governing agenda. In a way, our challenge, I think, is similar to a year ago when COVID hit and newsrooms realized, wow, this is a big story. It's not going away anytime soon, and we've got to get up to speed on it quickly. Now, the question is whether we can do the same on climate. A lot of people were thrown onto the COVID story without knowing a lot about it at the time, and I think we rose to the occasion pretty darn well. So let's see if we can do that same thing now on climate change. For answers to that question, we have assembled an absolutely stellar group of journalists, and I'll introduce them all together at once, and then we'll hear from each of them in turn. That'll be the first half hour of this webinar. The second half hour will be your questions and answers and discussion with the panel. So we've already gotten a lot of great questions through the RSVP process. You can add more on the chat function to the side of your screen. And of course, you're welcome to tweet using @CoveringClimateNow and or #CCNow. And so please give a warm virtual welcome to our panelists, and I'll introduce them in their speaking order. First, my dear colleague, Bernadette Woods-Plackey. She's the Chief Meteorologist and Director at Climate Matters in the Newsroom. Next will be Justin Warland, who is the Senior Climate Correspondent at Time Magazine. After Justin will come Kate Shepard. She's the Senior Enterprise Editor at HuffPost. And finally, Ben Tracy. He's the CBS News Senior National and Environmental Correspondent. As I say, we'll hear from each one of them in turn. And Bernadette Woods-Plackey, take it away.
All right, thank you so much, Mark. And so wonderful to be with everyone today. Bear with me as I share my screen here. We know this is always just a process, but we're getting there. And what I'm going to do is give you a quick Climate Change 101. It's quick, so we're going to move here. Hope you're ready. To start out with, the quickest way I've ever heard someone describe climate change is in 10 words, and this is a dear friend and colleague, Ed Maybeck at George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. It's real, it's us. Experts agree, it's serious, and there's hope. So that's the quickest way you can really summarize what we're about to get into. So let's get started. The science of climate change, and the reason we have such succinct understanding of what's going on, goes back to the 1800s. It all comes down to the greenhouse effect. That's where we know that the sun comes in, it warms our planet, some of that sunlight bounces off and escapes back up into space. Other parts of that sunlight and the energy are captured in our atmosphere in what we call greenhouse gases. Well understood, nobody challenges this. We understand what those greenhouse gases are, and we can measure them. And we know that since the beginning of the industrial age, these numbers are going through the roof. It is the highest we've ever been with our levels of greenhouse gas, and focusing here specifically on carbon dioxide, one of the leading forms of greenhouse gases. It's not only the highest it's been in at least 800,000 years, science thinks maybe 3 to 5 million years, but it's also the rate of change that we're experiencing that is so extraordinary and something we've never experienced in human history. So we're really pushing our limits. Now we know where this comes from. I'm going to break this down between the United States and globally. In the US, our leading source of emissions are through transportation, very close second, electricity. Now globally, it's a little bit different, but generally the same sources. Transportation isn't as big of a role globally, but what plays a bigger role globally is land use and agriculture, where we have this big, beautiful rainforests and how we're really incorporating them into our whole global climate system. So we know where these are coming from, and we're measuring more of them in our atmosphere. And the thing is, the more greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere, the more we turn up that thermostat. There's a direct connection between carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases and our temperature. And since 1880 here, sort of the best measuring of records to start here, we've already turned up that thermostat by a degree Celsius. And just to put that in perspective, remember that the Paris Climate Change Agreement has this goal of limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius with an aspiration of 1.5. And look at that, already at 1.1. And after we finalize all of last year's numbers, and it's happening right now, we're pushing that 1.2. So 1 degree, what does that mean? Well, it shifts us into an entirely new climate. This is what we just saw last week on full display in the United States. We still have cold in this distribution of temperatures. It's still possible, but it just doesn't happen quite as much as compared to the amount of heat that we are shifting into our entire system. For every round of record cold, we're getting 4 to 6 rounds of record heat. And that is changing our weather across the board. Not only those days where it's challenging our human health, but it's supercharging our entire water cycle. So there's more evaporation in the atmosphere. And when it does come down, it's coming down in buckets, big downpours. The other thing, when we don't get that water, the drought is intensifying and it's setting the stage for these big explosive wildfires like we saw in the United States last year, Australia, and Siberia, really big, life-shattering moments. The other thing too, look at this, hurricanes, they are typhoons, cyclones, different names across the globe, but they're all getting stronger. They're intensifying more rapidly. They're bringing more rain with them. And when they do make landfall, they're coming with a higher storm surge because of sea level rise. So it's not just our atmosphere that's warming. The vast majority of our heat that is coming into the climate system is going into our oceans. Over 90% is going into the oceans. That is raising our sea levels. That's shifting entire food ecosystems. It's bleaching our corals. And our oceans are also sucking up all of that carbon dioxide. That's changing the chemistry of our oceans. But it's not just the health and the ecosystems in the ocean, it's human health that's being challenged here too. We're having worsening air quality across the board. We're also seeing stronger, longer allergy seasons. And our bugs like mosquitoes and ticks that carry diseases are spreading farther and they're lasting longer. We're seeing that human health is challenged, but also our economies are being challenged on a really extraordinary level. If you look at this average on the top left-hand chart, we used to have these billion-dollar disasters a couple of times a year. I mean, $1 billion to that level. Last year alone in the United States, there were over 20 of those. It's just absolutely extraordinary. We're seeing how it's changing our power systems. A lot of what was on display in Texas. Now, not all of that was weather related and climate related, but weather related power outages are on the rise. And climate change is getting into so much of what we do. And the reason we call it a story for every beat, it's changing our sports. It's changing some of our favorite beverages, right? Beer, coffee, wine are all being threatened with our changing climate. So it's weather, it is food, land and sea, water, health, economy. Sometimes people don't make this full connection, but this is a racial equality and a social justice story on so many levels, because those who are hurt the hardest are getting even amplified with the impacts of climate change. Infrastructure, buildings, roads, energy, transportation, coastal flooding, changing oceans, shifting ecosystems, shifting seasons, national security, migration, sports, lifestyle activities, and our ways of life. This is a story for all of these, because all of these aspects of life are being affected by climate change. So what do we do, right? What does that mean for us? Well, this is where we are. Last year, with COVID and all of the restrictions we saw on movement and transportation, we did see a dip in our emissions. The thing is, that's not how we want to do this, right? We want to do this in a sustainable and equitable way moving forward. And last year, depending on which data source you look at, it was about a 5 to 7% dip in emissions. We need between 2.5 to 7.5% dip in emissions every year for the next decade to have a chance of making these global goals that we have in the Paris Climate Change Agreement. So this is not going to be easy, but it is doable. And this is what I want to leave you with today. We have the technology and solutions already in place to make a lot of these really big transitions and start to bring those emissions down in big ways. Again, it's not going to be easy, but we can do it. And the public, they know something's happening. Sometimes they don't know exactly what's happening. They have a lot of questions about this, and you're in an opportunity to connect the dots for them. There's such a range of stories, from electrifying transport. I mean, honestly, if you haven't driven an electric car yet, it's fun. It's not just a moral thing. This is actually a fun transition out there too. It's cleaner air for our kids on their school buses. We're looking at solar and wind. May sound like, oh, it's been around a while, and it has, but we need to scale it. And the fact that the world has come together and agreed upon limiting these emissions going forward in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the fact the United States is back is enormous. The world does not agree very often on any single issues, and they did, because they know how serious this is. So this is why you hear scientists talk about this being an emergency, a crisis, and such urgency in the voice. And this is why it is a story for every beat. So as we go forward, the future really is our choice, and we have this opportunity to answer the questions that the public has about what's happening. So there is your quick summary of a Climate 101. I'm going to hand it back to Mark.
Thank you, Bernadette. And there you have it, folks. That's why the scientists call this an emergency. It's not just that the changes we need to make are so far-reaching, or that the dangers that we're looking at are so fearsome. It's also how quickly these changes have to happen. We need action immediately, which is why we're happy that so many of you are with us here today, because without better coverage in the media of this, there will not be the public awareness and therefore the political pressure to make those changes happen. So I'm going to turn now to my colleague, Justin Warland at Time Magazine. And Justin, you've been on the climate beat for quite a while now. And so I'd like to let folks learn from your experience here. And let me start by talking about the Biden administration. He has made it very clear that climate is going to be core to his governing agenda. And they talk throughout the government. All of his cabinet people during their confirmation hearings were saying, we are taking an all of government approach to climate policy. So the State Department, the Treasury Department, Transportation Department, the Agriculture Department, everybody is going to be focused on climate change. It strikes me that we, therefore, in the media kind of need an all of newsroom approach to covering this story, not just the science beat. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you have been doing at Time Magazine to try and help your colleagues who are just getting up to speed on the climate story?
Yeah, well, thanks, Mark, for everything you do and for having me. Yeah, I mean, I think it's to talk a little bit about what we're doing at Time. It's just about facilitating a conversation and trying to help people get up to speed so they understand, both the basics, like what Bernadette talked about, and also help formulate stories and think about ways that they can contribute to this area of coverage. For me, it's in large part, frankly, meetings, Slack messages, conversations that are exchanges, showing that I'm open to having those kinds of exchanges. It's more amorphous than sort of any sort of rigid structure, but it's about creating a dialogue, and letting people feel comfortable knowing that this is a tricky thing to jump into, but encouraging them to do that even while it's tricky.
Are you finding, Justin, that your colleagues are reaching out more to you now, or is it? I remember when we had you on a previous Talking Chop, you said that I kind of go around and kind of tap people on the shoulder. Has that changed now that Biden's in office?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a combination of both. So there's definitely people who are interested in stories on their beat. They'll hear that the such and such person, whether it's a nominee or somebody talking about climate, and they don't know much about that area, and they'll come to me and ask a question. And I've had a few of those exchanges. There is also, I look at the story list and say, oh, this person is working on a story about something, they probably should get a graph in there about climate, make sure that doesn't get lost in the picture. And so trying to find ways to sort of insert myself there. But I mean, to your point, the climate has totally changed around climate, and there is a lot more interest that's bubbling up that isn't initiated by me. I mean, it's just striking when I, have been on calls and people say, well, I hear the NDCs are coming, and I'm like, I can't believe that anybody else is talking about NDCs. But those are the kinds of things that have just really changed in a very short amount of time.
And so, what are NDCs?
Nationally determined contributions, commitments. Oops, but they're countries' commitments to plans to tackle climate change and reduce emissions, submitted to the UN climate change body, originally ahead of Paris, but now by the end of the year, the countries are supposed to come up with new NDCs.
So that's going to be one of the big stories, actually. And on Earth Day, which is part of the reason covering climate now, is timing our week of coverage, at least the spring one, to Earth Day, is President Joe Biden will be convening a summit of world leaders virtually, of course, at the White House to discuss climate change. And in particular, how do we meet the Paris targets? There will be the follow-up conference in November in Glasgow, Scotland. One last question to you, Justin, before we turn to Kate and Ben. I want everybody to know that Time Magazine has long been a leader, arguably really put climate change on the media map in this country by naming Endangered Planet Earth as its Person of the Year in 1989. So Time has been cutting edge for a long time on this. And one of the other ways you're cutting edge, Justin, is that you've been out early on the intersectionality of the climate story. In particular, environmental justice. So for folks who are on this call who are maybe just getting onto this beat, can you say a quick word about that and why it's important and how to begin covering it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess where to start? I think with regard to environmental justice, I mean, we can see just in the last year the effects of disproportionate impact of pollution on people of color with COVID, and the way in which the health effects of from living near a toxic facility has left people at greater risk. I mean, with regard to covering intersectional issues, I mean, I think it makes sense, I guess, thinking about advice I would give to people is to choose an area that they find particularly interesting and really try to become an expert in it. This is, as we've discussed, such a broad beat that it's worthwhile. There aren't people, thinking deeply about a lot of these things on a day-to-day basis. And so I think I would say, it makes sense to get up to speed on the big picture questions about NDCs, about what the administration is doing. But, if you can do a few things, do that, and then also go really deep on one area of intersectional issues and become the expert on it. And I think that's a way to elevate the conversation and also your own individual reputation on the beat if you're new to it.
Thanks. That's Justin Worland. He's the senior climate correspondent at Time Magazine. And of course, you can come to the website at coveringclimatenow.org. We have a lot of the fact sheets that would give you that background and let you get up to speed. If you get thrown onto the story at the 10 o'clock story meeting, read those for an hour and you can actually put a story on the air that night that will not embarrass you. We promise. So we're going to move now to Kate Shepard at HuffPost. And Kate, could you start? I want to get into intersectionality because you guys have done some great coverage on that too. But first, could you just tell us how you came onto the story and how HuffPost is grappling with the new demands really on covering the climate story?
Sure. So I came into covering climate change in 2006 as a newly graduated from undergrad person, and I was a time when An Inconvenient Truth came out, and it was, the run up to the 2008 election where people were talking about climate change on both sides of the aisle, McCain versus Obama. So it was a time when climate was really at the center of our conversation for the first time. I think we're kind of coming back to a point like that again, but covered climate and environment almost exclusively for about 11 years. I had some detours into labor and health issues as well, but I moved into more of an editing role at HuffPost about 3 years ago. My team includes our environment reporters. We have 2 folks who are exclusively focused on environment, but my team is called the Business and Environment team, which is kind of a misnomer. Really, I have the policy team, because that includes our health policy reporters, our labor policy person, our economic policy, our housing and urban development, our tax policy person, and somebody I'm forgetting. I think that's everybody. There's 8 people on my team. We have a really wide range of beats, but really it's all focused on different policy challenges, and we connect so many of them to the climate crisis. I think, as Mark was saying, the Biden's all of government approach. I try to take an all of beats approach to climate in our newsroom, because I think this is going to be a huge challenge across all these issues that we cover, and that being able to see the way this intersects and the way that climate really underlies so many of these challenges is important for everyone, regardless of your beat. And one of the reasons I became a climate reporter is because I was not someone who was like looking to become an environment reporter. I was someone who wanted to become a political reporter who happened to become really fascinated by all the challenges of climate change. It's a political challenge, it's a policy challenge, it's a science challenge. It's international relations, it's health, it's I had a list here of all the things the reasons I love this beat, but really sometimes people act like environment is this niche beat, but I see it as such the opposite. It really underlies so many things, and having an understanding of those connections is really important, I think, to being any reporter right now in 2021. And I also think it's really helped strengthen a lot of our reporters on their COVID coverage, because there's so many things that are familiar across the 2 issues, whether that's just understanding of science and understanding of inequalities and vulnerabilities, but also just understanding of disinformation and misinformation and what motivates some of the political decisions and policy decisions that are, not really reflective of the science. So I think it's useful knowledge and training for a lot of issues that you might cover.
Let me give a quick shout out here. Speaking of disinformation, Kate, this week's Climate Beat newsletter carries a column by my colleague, Andrew McCormick, which talks specifically about climate disinformation and gives very valuable tools and directions on how to responsibly cover disinformation without amplifying that disinformation. I'll give you a hint. It involves something called a truth sandwich. You have to read more to find out the details. Kate, can you say a little bit about, just from a manager's point of view, it's one thing to say, yeah, we have to cover this across all the issues, but on a day-to-day basis with working your reporters, can you help our colleagues here understand how to make that really a successful venture?
Sure. There's a couple different ways that I think that we have been successful in this front. One is just that we have a culture at HuffPost of reporting together and reporting, co-bylining and combining our expertise. We're not a place where people are really protective of like, this is my story, it's not your story. I think people are really open to, and I encourage it, that we are going to work together and that we're going to help each other out by bringing together our expertise across beats. So, we did a series about work and climate change 2 years ago now, but which involved our labor reporter, a reporter who was covering like food systems, and another reporter who was covering natural disasters. So how do you bring together those expertise? Or often geographic as well. one of the values in my newsroom is that, we have people in California, we have people in Colorado. So if there's something like a wildfire crisis, we have people who are covering things regionally, as well as people who are really fluent in policy and political discussions around that as well. So how do you bring people together to enhance the work and make the sum greater than the parts, right? So that's part of it. Always encouraging people to look for opportunities to work together. Another is to look for partnerships. We are often looking to partner with other folks. Obviously, we're part of covering climate now. We're also part of the climate desk, which is run through Mother Jones. We have partnered with a bunch of different national and international organizations that support different kinds of local and regional journalism, and brought those reporters together with our reporters to nationalize or or bring a national focus to a regional issue. And so we're always looking for ways that we can partner with folks around the country and enhance local storytelling and put it in that context of making it a national story as well. So I think that another thing we've done is really using freelance networks as well to highlight specifically stories that are, in parts of the country where we're not. So whether that's a regional story or just a story of something that's happening to a specific community or demographic group that maybe we are not aware of because we are located where we're located, but how do we really use freelance networks smartly to enhance our climate coverage? I'm based in North Carolina. Most of my team is spread out across the country, but a lot of people are in New York or DC. So how do we get to those other places where we're not?
Collaboration, folks, collaboration. And let's get away from the old ego trip of this is my story and not your story. Thank you. That's been Kate Shepard, senior editor at HuffPost. And now we'll turn to Ben Tracy. He is the new climate change correspondent for CBS News. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but I believe this is the first time in CBS's history that they've had an actually dedicated climate change correspondent. So welcome, and let's talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to say it's something a little out of school here. Ben, you were a little worried about coming onto this panel at first, precisely because you're relatively new to the beat. You're not a total newbie, but let's talk about that, because that's part of the reason we actually wanted you here, because you have a long and distinguished career of reporting on many other topics. And now you're coming onto climate. So talk us through that, how you have dealt with that, both as an individual journalist, and then how CBS came to this decision to really increase its emphasis on the climate story this year.
Sure. Yeah. When you first asked me to do this, I think I basically said, I'm not worthy. I've only been on this beat for a couple of weeks, so it feels very weird to be in any position of trying to give people advice about anything. So I'm here listening as much as I am talking. But in terms of what CBS has done, it's been great. I'm really grateful that they're investing in this beat and the coverage that we will do. And I think that comes out of a couple of things. One, the changeover in administration. I think there's just going to be so much more news and action on climate if the administration lives up to its promises. And then also, this has gotten to a point, especially for a lot of the stories that we cover on television, whether those are hurricanes, wildfires, what just happened in Texas, where these climate threads keep appearing and you just can't deny this anymore. And so I think there is a space for more dedicated coverage on the topic. This has been a weird transition for me. I was covering the Trump White House for the last 2 years. So to go from that to a climate beat is two very different things. But my interest in this goes back quite a ways. I'm from Minnesota originally, and I used to work at WCCO, the CBS affiliate there. And about 16, 17 years ago when I was there, our main anchor at the time, Don Shelby, he had a real passion for these issues as well, and was really kind of ahead of the curve in terms of doing this kind of stuff on local news. And we had a dedicated thing there called Project Energy, which I actually worked on with David Schechter, who you mentioned at the top of the program. We were colleagues. Our desks were actually next to each other, and David's just been, he did great work then and is obviously still doing it now. So this has been something that I've been passionate about too for a long time, and I'm just really grateful now that I can fully embrace it in terms of what I work on most days.
And Ben, say a little bit, if you can, I mean, nothing confidential, obviously, but how are you approaching this, and how are your colleagues at CBS approaching this now as far as that all across the newsroom approach? I know you're the climate correspondent, but there's a lot of other people at CBS who are now really, I think, interested in this story.
Yeah.
So how's that working on a practical basis? Yeah,
this is not a one-man show. There's so much to do that having one person doing it would just be silly and not taking it seriously. We have a lot of correspondents who are very interested in this. We have Jeff Biradelli, who who is a climate expert and one of our meteorologists who is doing great work. But what's been really refreshing for me to see is that on just kind of daily stories people are doing, they are mentioning climate change when it's appropriate, instead of just waiting for a story to be done that's kind of the big overview of the topic. It's being woven into the stories we did about Texas, which weren't stories I did. It was the correspondents there on the ground. And they talked about the impact of climate change and how that is changing the weather in Texas and how the grid there is not prepared for that. So I think it's about integrating our coverage, and that's going to be everybody, really across the network.
Mm-hmm. And when they do that, when there's correspondents, say in Texas on the ground, do they call up you or call up Jeff Baradelli, who, as you mentioned, is your network's meteorologist and climate specialist, to sort of check the facts? Or are they now at a place where they have the climate confidence to really interweave climate into a general story on a disaster like that?
I think a lot of people at CBS in particular are pretty well versed on these things, and they can do that. But certainly Jeff, and I hope now in this position I can be a resource for people. I'm still dealing with my own learning curve, trying to read everything I can and get up to speed on everything as I take on this beat. But yeah, I think if you've been reporting for a while, you've covered these stories. I mean, I lived in California for 9 years, was covering the West Coast for CBS, did tons of stories about wildfires and mudslides and droughts. I lived in Beijing for 2 years and did lots of stories about their environmental crisis and efforts there as well. So I think just over time as a journalist, you do find yourself covering these things. And I think most people are wise enough to kind of learn it as they go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to open it up to Q&A, but first, thank you. That's been Ben Tracy. He is the new climate change correspondent for CBS News. And I'm going to take a couple of questions that came in over the RSVP first, and I'll pitch them to each one of you in turn and decide if we can. Not everybody has to comment on every question, but here's something that I think a lot of people are feeling now, which is a question from a meteorologist at a TV station in Texas who says, what can I do when my news managers insist that climate change is a political issue, and they are afraid that it will cost us viewers if we talk about it because our demographics do not believe in climate change. They have even made me sign a document not to talk or write about climate change on the air. Help. So maybe, Ben, could you take that one since you're a fellow TV person?
Sure.
Anybody else who wants to chime in, please do.
Yeah, that's tough if that's what their management is telling them, and I think that's unfortunate. I mean, that's if you take climate out of it, that's just not journalism to ignore what you know to be true based on what you think your viewers want to hear. So hopefully there'd be a workaround for that. But I think there are ways to talk about this in a less political fashion, to not make this sound like it's a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, climate deniers, climate believers, and really just present the information. And when you're talking about that as a local weather person, which is not a job I've ever done, but I think there are ways to talk about that where you're really just explaining, over the course of X many years, the temperature here has averaged up, how many degrees. Those are just facts. And I think you can just kind of connect the dots for people without having to be as overt about it if you are worried about turning people off. Because the one thing that I would say about that is I do think we should attempt to try to bring people into the tent, to not alienate people from this, so they can learn and they can come to believe something maybe perhaps that for a while they have not thought is true. So I think that's also part of the mission of our coverage.
Yeah, in that regard, I highly commend to everyone the piece that David Schechter won his DuPont Award for. He took a member of his audience who was a climate denier there in Dallas and took him on a road trip, literally a road trip, met with scientists, went to Alaska, saw the glaciers melting, and tried to sort of walk this person through the science and in a real world way. And it was a beautiful piece of journalism that never once condescended to the point of view that viewer had. Bernadette, could you add a quick word here, because your organization, Climate Matters in the Newsroom, has really worked with a lot of TV meteorologists over the last 10 years. And that used to be a part of our profession that was dominated by climate deniers. And partly because you guys have talked with them about the science, that's now turned around. But how would you advise this colleague of yours who is being pressured by management not to tell the truth?
First of all, if they would like to follow up, I mean, we could dive deeper into this, but for this discussion, just the kind of quick overview, that's really tough. That's hard. But if you're going to approach it from the role of the TV meteorologist, which is slightly different than a journalist at times, you're seeing the changes. It's just connecting the dots in the moments. Ben gave an example of a temperature rise. I mean, you could take a warm spring day, for example, right now and say, we're getting more of these with climate change, and just show the graph. We have a ton of resources at climatecentral.org for this exact purpose and the full program to support you in doing this. But I also want to note that if you go to the Yale climate opinion maps, you can get a better sense of your audience, because there's this misconception of what your audience really thinks about this issue. The true people who will never listen to the science are less than 10% of the population. And even on the Yale climate opinion maps, they downscale it to different parts of the country, you can look at the counties that make up your DMA, and you can see that overwhelmingly more people do support this issue and have questions about it. They just want to learn, right? What's going on? What are these changes? What do they mean to me, my family, and what can we do about it? So it's just connecting the dots in the moment, but I dig into the actual data of what your audience thinks, because I think that there's some people think that more people are against this issue than really are.
I want to hop in real quickly. One, I would love to see that document that you had to sign. So if you would like to send it to me, my email is kate.shepherd@huffpost.com. That is fascinating and horrible. I am sorry. Two, one thing that I have learned over the years is always to try to connect the science and what we know about climate change to what people already care about. And you'll find that that is actually pretty easy. I mean, I grew up on a farm. I know lots of Republican farmers who are totally understand that what they're seeing and what they've seen is not normal, whether it's precipitation patterns or extreme weather events. Like, they're people who fundamentally understand that this is not normal and that we're experiencing some really extreme changes. And I think it's something you can clearly communicate with them about. I think that's also true about people who maybe care about the military. Like, if you look at what the military is doing to prepare both domestic and internationally at our bases, or if you care about, like, if you have an audience that's religious or pro-life, there are really ways that you can connect these to issues that people already care about. I don't think we can assume that people will care about it for the reasons that we do, which is maybe just a pure understanding of science and urgency, but can you connect it to other things people care about?
That's such an important point, Kate. And I too grew up on a farm, and I know a lot of those people. We have another question in the queue that you've already sort of answered, which basically relates to, we're getting a lot of pushback from people in rural areas about this. And I think Kate's comments here are so important. If you actually go talk to those people, and again, watch David Schechter's piece. It's very long for television. It's about 14 minutes, but really superb, because so much of it is the tone. It's the tone of how you approach them. And as Kate said, finding areas of common ground. Let me ask another question now. And Justin, I'd like to put this one to you, a little related to what we just talked about, but it's more, the question is, how do you explain cold weather as part of climate change? We get that pushback every time we do a story about this, and obviously the recent example of Texas. So can you give us a little tip on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say stick to the data. I mean, Bernadette showed a great image of, it doesn't, just because things shift and are warmer, that doesn't mean that we're not going to have cold days. I think you also explained something like, there's some debate, but the science around the polar vortex and what that means and how that could be related to climate change. But I guess it's just as simple in my mind as pointing out the trend and what the data shows, and acknowledging that we're going to have cold weather. That's still a thing.
We still do have winters, thank God, for a while. Here's another question, and this is something that we've touched on slightly, but this person wants to drill down a little bit further. Here's the question. I would love to hear about how the panelists' news organizations coordinate and manage their cross-newsroom climate coverage. Do you have climate working groups with reporters and editors from different desks who come together, or is it siloed, Or is it just a general priority within the newsroom that's catch as catch can? So who wants to talk about that first? You've all touched on it a little bit, but if we could just get down a little bit more into some practical specifics, I would just start by saying I would urge you not to silo. Silo is, that way lies disaster. That person who is in the silo will be overworked, and the audience will not get the benefit of that person's knowledge across all the other beats. But how do you actually make that happen, especially in a relatively large newsroom? Maybe Ben, we start with you, and then to Kate, and then to Justin.
Sure, I'm actually more interested in their answers because I'd love to know, because we're just kind of starting this and trying to figure out how that's all going to work with, we've identified the people in the organization that are interested in these stories and want to be a part of telling them. So I think internally we have to figure out what is the processes for sharing information and for figuring out who's going to do what stories, so we're not all kind of chasing the same thing and spinning our wheels. So I'm going to be quiet and actually listen to the other two and see what they're doing.
Justin and Kate, tell us your experience on this, and don't hesitate to tell us lessons learned from mistakes, so that others can learn from the mistakes, if any were made. Justin, you want to go first, and then Kate?
Sure. I mean, we have now I guess we would call it like a working group that meets. Well, actually, we had our first meeting, I think, probably in February of 2020, and then our second last month. So, but we have a group that meets regularly to bring across everybody who's sort of interested in this area, people who it's part of their formal remit, and people who are just sort of interested in dipping their toes into it. So we have that sort of regular meeting, as well as like there's a Slack group, and as I said, the more sort of informal communication that happens between a few of us and and anyone else in the newsroom who's interested. I think it's nice to have both the formal and the informal approach, and to sort of incorporate them so that it's a little more fluid. But yeah, I'm curious, of course, everybody else's experience as well.
Kate, let's hear from you. And also, obviously, everybody's still kind of figuring this out, but is there a dream plan that you have that you would really aspire to?
Yeah, I think my newsroom is definitely smaller than both Justin and Ben's, so it's maybe not as complicated. I mean, really for us, it's a lot about our coordination between our breaking news team and our enterprise team, and then we also have a life team. And how do we think about what are the things that each of us is doing within our purview, and then just kind of constant conversation, particularly between editors, but then also between people who are interested in the subject matter. And a lot of that happens on Slack now. That happened before because we were, a virtual team in a lot of ways anyway, because people are spread out across the country. So I think it's just a lot of just like communication about what you're working on, asking for help, and then just, I also just think there's an ethos in my newsroom where a lot of people are interested in these kinds of stories, and it's just not siloed because this is not how we see the issue.
Thanks.
And Mark,
yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to add one thing. Last week we actually had a good example at CBS of how this worked well. My colleague Kara, who is on the digital side at CBS, and so the day that we rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, she had written this really excellent primer on what the Paris Climate Accord is, what does it mean to get back into it, what are the targets, and then that day I had a sit down one-on-one with John Kerry, kind of going through the whole, why we're rejoining and what that means for the United States, and where do we stand in terms of how much time do we have left to really address this issue. And it was a nice 1-2 punch on the TV side and the digital side, and to pair those up. And internally, people noticed that there was a real effort on that topic that day. So that's one way to do it too, where it's not just, I think sometimes for me, I can think pretty siloed about what am I putting on any one show. But CBS News is so much bigger than just our morning show or our evening news.
That's an excellent example, very practical for how this can work. And Ben, we're going to follow up with you afterwards. I'd love to get Kara's primer on the Paris Accord for our resources section at Covering Climate Now. I think that's be useful for a lot of people, especially as we get ready for the Earth Day Climate Summit at the White House on April 22. Now, here's a question from one of our colleagues overseas about a situation in India, but that nevertheless has a lot of relevance for work here, especially around the pipeline fights. There's the big pipeline fight now is pipeline number 3, which is again Enbridge, which was the company behind the Keystone pipeline, going through Minnesota. I happen to know that Bill Weir, the climate correspondent at CNN, is on his way to Minnesota now to report on that. So here's the question. A climate activist has been arrested in India as part of a general government crackdown on dissent. It's now increasingly difficult for journalists to report on climate and environmental issues. How does one navigate this challenge while reporting? So how do you navigate the challenge of reporting on activism at a time when governments or police authorities are cracking down? Who wants to have a crack at that?
I mean, we've been doing a lot of coverage. One of my colleagues, Alex Kaufman, has been covering a lot about how the ways that laws are being changed to put stricter penalties on people who are arrested during protests. He did a piece actually last Saturday about 4 new state laws that have been introduced, and he's looking at not just like what each state law says, but where is it coming from? What is the system that is actually trying to encourage states to do these? And what does that mean for people who do get arrested at protests? So I think for us, a lot of it is just like highlighting the systems and personalities and organizations that underlie these different state level actions, and then who's being affected by them. I am hesitant to talk about the India context because is going to be far different than what I deal with here in the US. I mean, for us, it really is just about like, keeping the focus on and highlighting the places in which activism is being criminalized.
I would also urge people to look at the Columbia Journalism Review, which of course was one of our co-founders, and they report on these issues a lot by way of making the larger point. One of the things that we can do as journalists, and I believe we must do, is to stand in solidarity with our colleagues when they are in these situations. And one of the most important ways we can do that is to use our megaphones to not let the authorities think that they're going to be disciplining or worse journalists without the world knowing. Because when these kinds of authority figures know that the world is watching, it tends to diminish their enthusiasm for those kinds of activities. So that's one thing that we can do. It doesn't quite get to the question of what do you do there on the ground, but having been in a couple of those situations, not in India, I would say, but in China, where it's equally difficult. It really helps to have allies. Make sure that you are connected to other people in the civil society, whether they be in the journalism space, the NGO space, or parts of the government, church and religious organizations. Don't go alone. That's where it gets dangerous. Let me ask another question here from the RSVP, and we will get to the ones who are coming in on the chat. Someone says there's been so little reporting on line 3. Yes, that's true, but it is about to change, I think. Okay, one more here from, here's a question of when you're directing your message to underserved communities, your climate coverage that is, how do you, if at all, do you adjust that message? Who wants to take that? Kate, you just spoke. Justin, you have a thought on that perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that the sort of overall thought I would say is trying to find ways to relate stories back to the people who are reading them, and whatever your audience might be. If it's an underserved community, I mean, there are a lot of ways in which climate change is affecting people in underserved communities. We're talking about environmental justice and the sort of impacts of climate on frontline communities. I mean, I guess I would just say, talk about the things that relate to people's day-to-day lives. And that's the same, no matter who you're talking to.
Yeah, that's what we're emphasizing as well in our upcoming week of coverage in the lead up to the Earth Day on April 22. We're having all of our Covering Climate Now partners, we're urging them, I should say, to do human-centered stories that start with people, which gets you around a lot of these other issues about, oh, the science is too remote, or how do I talk to all these different parts of the audience? If you tell a human story, you will connect with other humans. And most of our audience is other humans. So it's very convenient that way. And one quick word about that week of living through the climate emergency. We mean living through in both senses of that term. Living through in terms of experiencing the climate emergency. So we're going to be seeing a lot of stories about how the climate emergency is affecting, for example, coastal dwellers in Florida or the folks in Texas. But living through the climate emergency also in how we survive it. So solutions stories. And that has been shown to be a very interesting part of the story for audiences, to just speak very crassly and commercially for a moment, to reach people. It helps to, it's important always to not be shy about the science, but also to be clear that, as Bernadette said at the end of her presentation, we have the tools to do this. It's a question of the political will and the economic reforms and so forth. So one more question from the RSVPs, and then we'll go to the ones that are coming in. And this is a little bit like what we just talked about. A lot of climate journalism focuses on politics, disasters, and elite decision makers that are beyond the sphere of ordinary individuals. So how do we journalists cover issues in a way that engages individuals on the ground and help our audiences not feel intimidated by this subject? How do we not let our audiences feel intimidated? Bernadette, do you, I think that's kind of right up your alley.
So in general, just how to jump into this in a non-intimidating way. I think it's rehashing a lot of what we've just been talking about. And I did put some points in the chat too, because there have been some great questions popping up. It's, you know, it's know your audience. That's the golden rule of communication, right? But that's topic, timing, tone. It's what Kate was pointing out of meeting people where they are. It's so critical to connect with people on shared values, because as we've shown, this affects everything. So there's something that it's affecting in your life as a way to connect with that too. And it's also personalizing, localizing, drawing out the faces, the personal experiences. And one thing that we hear more than anything is this fear of jumping into the subject matter versus the reaction you get once you start publishing climate stories. And there always seems to be more fear than pushback. Now, there are always going to be some of those voices out there. I'm not saying there isn't, and social media has a mind of its own, and some of it isn't really even from human beings, but there is that, and it's a small percent of the population. They may have a loud voice, but in the way you break down society's views on climate change, it's less than 10%. So you're ignoring 90% of your population that wants to hear more about what's going on. They may not be the one constantly tweeting you and asking you questions, but they're curious. They're passive media people. They just take it and they move on. So don't ignore those people just because a couple of people have a loud voice. So I think it's sticking with the facts, personalizing. You guys are great journalists. You've got the skill set for this. You jump into other subject matters that are complicated, and you do it. So just apply this and find your own voice in this subject matter.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful rule. I've always heard of the 80-20 rule, but this is a nice amendment to that 90-10 rule. 90% of the audience wants to hear this. Don't be bullied by the 10%. Okay, quick question on investigative reporting, something near and dear to my heart. What role will investigative journalism play in holding policymakers and company executives responsible for climate commitments, I assume under the Paris Agreement? Investigative reporting, who wants to speak to that?
I can just say briefly, I mean, I think it definitely will play a role. And I think with the Biden administration in particular, there's obviously been a lot of talk so far. There's been a lot of promises made. And I think part of our job is to hold their feet to the fire on that and see if they actually make good on the promises and the pledges that they're making. But in the larger sense, in terms of what companies have done in the past, there's been so much good journalism on what these companies knew and when they knew it. I brought a bunch of books that I've been reading as I've been trying to educate myself on this. I just read this book, Losing Earth, which is just a really nice summary of basically 30 years of climate denialism and the role that companies like Exxon and others played in that. So there's been, I think, already great journalism on that front, and there will continue to need to be that as we move forward.
Yeah, that great investigative journalism, for those of you who don't know or who are relatively new to the beat, Perhaps you've seen the hashtag ExxonNew. That goes back to a series of investigative reports that ran in end of 2015 by the Los Angeles Times, by Inside Climate News, which is a Covering Climate Now partner, and also by the Columbia Journalism School, which is where Covering Climate Now began. And they went back into the Exxon archives and showed that not only did the scientists at Exxon know as early as the 1970s, but they told the top executives. And for 40 years now, they have been lying about it rather than telling the world that their products were causing what we now see with the climate emergency. So there's that. And I would add just one point to what Ben said about holding the Biden people accountable. Let's also hold accountable the same people who have been lying and obstructing progress on this in Washington for decades. And that, I'm sorry to say, is now mainly the Republican Party. So will they continue to obstruct that? Will they continue to deny the climate science at a point when so much of the rest of the country is ready to move? We now have 70% of the public who wants action on this. So, all right, we're now 3 minutes from the end of the hour. I'm going to give each one of the panelists one last shot to say anything that you'd like to add before we close off, and we'll go in the same order that we began. Bernadette Woods-Plackey.
Well, first of all, thank you again for joining us, everyone, and all these great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. If you want to reach out to me, bplackey@climatecentral.org. Welcome continuing this conversation. And again, I just can't stress enough, if you're new to this, don't be afraid. There are ways to do it. It's just finding your way to do it.
That's Bernadette Woods-Plackey from Climate Central and Climate Matters in the Newsroom. Justin Worland of Time Magazine.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining, and Mark for inviting me. I guess I would follow up on one thing Mark said and then a closing point, just on the point about investigations. I think there's so much that we know that's been written about, Exxon knew, et cetera, but the public doesn't necessarily understand. And so I think it's worth acknowledging that not every piece of journalism is going to be groundbreaking in the sense that it's going to expose something we didn't know. But for your readers, it might be exposing something that they didn't grapple with. So I would encourage a continued set of investigations and research, even on things that have already been addressed. And I guess my other point was just going to be what I said earlier, which is find a niche, expose new connections that people aren't talking about in a niche that isn't being addressed. So I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Justin Worland of Time Magazine. Kate Shepard of HuffPost.
Sure. One note I had here that I didn't get to was just both readiness for the beat, which is that there are lots of opportunities that are free or funded to learn about climate change. A couple I have here is just the Climate Matters in the Newsroom, Metcalf Institute, Society of Environmental Journalists, the Institute of Journalism and Natural Resources. All of these have trainings that are funded for reporters who want to learn more about these subjects. Another thing I've been seeking out with my team and personally is training in hostile environment training, because everything is a hostile environment these days. I'm also personally seeking out Red Cross safety training courses if I'm going to be out in the field in extreme weather and other hostile kind of events. So find opportunities to be ready for what the beat might throw at you. And then the second part is rest, that it's important that you take care of yourself and your physical and mental health, because this is, the last year has been constant crisis coverage on COVID and racial injustice and economic, discord. So it's going to be be ready for the long haul. The climate crisis is going to be here for us for a long time. So take what you need to take care of yourself as well.
Well said. That's Kate Shepard at HuffPost. Ben Tracy, take us home.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks for including the newbie in this today. Just two things of advice that I would give people just based on my last couple of weeks of how I've brought myself up to speed. If you find yourself out there new to this, read everything you can, every book you can get your hands on and articles online. But one thing that I've done that's actually been really helpful is I've just been cold calling experts and scientists and just having conversations with people, names that I come across. The other day, I read about this guy at NOAA who's their expert on hurricane tracking and how climate models are changing how they forecast hurricanes. I called him up. He talked to me for an hour. He was great. It led to 2 different story ideas. So there's ways to do those sorts of things. And then I just wanted to mention on the side there's a question that somebody asked that I think is a really good one, where they said, do you ever feel you've crossed the line from journalist to advocate when covering climate change, which I think is a great question. It's something I've asked myself that, because it can feel uncomfortable at times when you do a story that's based on the science, based on the facts, and you get a lot of pushback from some folks. And perhaps covering the Trump administration was actually kind of helpful, because there were times where you just have to say what you know to be true and what you know to be false. And that's not advocacy, that's just journalism. So I think we always have to keep that in mind.
That's an excellent closing thought. And Ben, our condolences and sympathies that you had to spend so much of the last 2 years of your life in that very difficult work environment. We welcome you now to the Climate Beat and CBS News. So we're going to leave it there, folks. I will just quickly add that, of course, here at Covering Climate Now, we have many resources for you, and we do plenty of trainings and so forth. So go to our website. We'd love to have any of you who are interested in joining us. Please go there, and you'll find that the climate beats are there, and news and information about our upcoming week of coverage, living through the climate emergency that's leading up to the Earth Day, April 22 climate summit in the White House with President Biden. So we are going to leave it there, but if you have other topics that you would like us to be discussing in future Talking Shops, please send us an email at editors@coveringclimatenow.org. I want to thank once again our excellent panel today, and thank all of you who have been here. We've had over 130, I think, people participating from all across the world. Covering Climate Now is organized by journalists for journalists. We couldn't do it without you. Thank you for being here. I'm Mark Hertzgaard, and I wish you a very pleasant day.